Good morning, everyone, and happy Monday. I wanted to give you all some feedback on the work you did on Module 4. So that's 4.1 and 4.2. 4.3 you did in the discussion board, and I'll be making some comments in the discussion board later today. But to start with 4.1, that was the strong learning objectives activity, and I just had a few comments on that one. And the biggest one is that objectives should be a single verb. Anytime you write an objective and you have an and in your sentence, it's a clue or a cue that it's really multiple objectives. So if you have students will write an annotation and analyze their annotations for clarity, that's really two objectives. So you want to split that up. So that word and should be a clue to you that you really have two objectives there. So you always want to split that up. And I saw that in multiple people and in multiple parts of the activity. So I really wanted to start out with that and make that clear that any kind of and is a clue that it should be two objectives. Now for the first example learning objective that you looked at, you were, that one was related to, the big thing there was it started with understand that information on any topic, etc., etc. Understand is not measurable, so we definitely want to flip that. And you probably should have created two new objectives for this one. So the original objective was understand that information on any topic is produced by a variety of researchers, individuals, and organizations. So understand is, getting students to understand is a pretty big thing. So first of all, that's not measurable. But then the whole rest of this, information on any topic is produced by a variety of researchers, individuals, and organizations. So I would challenge you to think about that a little bit more and figure out how you could turn that into measurable learning objectives and possibly split it up into a couple different ones to try to get students to that Bloom's level of understanding. So taking a step back, figuring out what is it that you really want students to get out of this and possibly split it up into multiple objectives. The second example was fine. There was really no revision needed there, and most of you got that. And then the third one was describe how to create a financial statement using Microsoft Excel. And first off, the relevance is missing there. What can be added to that objective to make it more relevant? And secondly, is describe really appropriate there, or is it more likely that we want the students to actually do it? Again, it does depend on context, but at first glance, you probably don't want students to describe how to create a financial statement. It's more likely that you just want them to create a financial statement. So we should really think about flipping the objective there, flipping the word there. But overall, you did pretty well on those strong learning objectives, and I was excited to see some good learning objectives being written on your mapped lesson. And then 4.2, that was some lesson examples, and you were critiquing those lessons. So I wanted to talk about all three of those because there were some things in there that came up in your responses. So lesson A was on searching as strategic exploration. That was the alignment with the IL framework. Didn't really have any other context for this lesson. We don't know who it was for, what level, no class, no discipline, no nothing. So we were missing quite a bit of context for this lesson. So that didn't help. But in general, it's not a well-written lesson. And a lot of you guys, I think pretty much everybody recognizes it's not a good lesson. And some of you just read what was written in the plan, what was on paper. You took what was written on paper and you wrote responses. But about half of you actually made some inferences on the lesson plan on what the instructor meant. So that was really interesting to see the two camps in the class. Some people read what was written and made responses there, and some of you made inferences. I'm not saying that either of you are right or wrong. I just thought that was interesting that some of you read between the lines and kind of answered that way. In general, the lesson wasn't really aligned. The objective did match the summative assessment, sort of. The idea of vetted keywords is not in the assessment, and it's not even explained elsewhere. We don't really even know what that means. And a lot of you did catch that the objectives sort of matched the assessment, but not really. But what was most often missed by the class was that it's not just about the objective and the assessment aligning. Everything else in between needs to be aligned as well. So the activities, the materials, lectures, anything that's happening in there has to be aligned. It's not just about aligning the beginning and the end. Everything in between should be aligned as well. And the final thing that I wanted to mention about Lesson A was was to pose a question. If you were given this lesson plan and the materials, would you be able to teach it? And that's kind of the bottom line for a lot of these lesson plans is, we're going through all these things. We want to make them student-centered. We're trying to incorporate learning theories, backwards design, alignment, all of these things. But after you do all of that, if you were given this lesson plan, would you be able to teach it? If the answer is no, definitely have some more work to do. And I think that's the biggest thing with this lesson. On the surface level, first glance, it could be okay, but if you actually had to teach a lesson from this, you probably wouldn't be able to. But overall, good job on that one. And then Lesson B, I really enjoyed reading your responses to this one because half of you thought it was super great and half of you thought it was really poor. And I'd say that both sides had good arguments. So the first thing about that was that Teaching Strategy 5 was not aligned. So this lesson was on data visualization and infographics, but Teaching Strategy 5 was definitely not aligned, and many of you caught that. But I also saw some comments that there were no formative assessments, there were no comprehension checks, which is incorrect. There were a lot of comments that were looking for more complex activities, but assessments don't always need to be complex. Sometimes an assessment can just be a poll or a short discussion or a Q&A. It doesn't always have to be okay, we're going to sit down and we're going to do this thing right now. It can be something quick and dirty. That doesn't always mean it's the best way to assess, but there were assessments in this lesson. Not saying that they're great assessments, but they did exist. Timing was definitely an issue in this session. An hour does not seem long enough for this content, and a lot of you guys mentioned that. However, I did feel like it was kind of a cop-out for those of you who said there was no time estimate given, so I'm just not going to answer the rest of this question. Which is true, there was no time estimate for each different chunk, but there was a time at the top of the lesson. It said that it was an hour. And from that, you could have tried to determine if the content of the lesson seemed like it was a reasonable amount of time overall. If someone, going back to that question I posed when I was talking about Lesson A, if someone were to give you this lesson, do you think you could do it in an hour? How would you break it up? Does that seem reasonable? So I was looking for a little bit more critical thinking on that question. They're asking about the timing. Because part of this activity was to push you to start thinking about your own lessons and how you might time them out, because that's an important part. You can have a great lesson and you have an hour to do it, but then when you really sit down and figure it out, are you going to be able to fit all of that in 1 hour? And for Lesson B, probably not. It would not work out well. One of the last questions was, is each chunk focused on a single objective? Chunk 5, and I mentioned this earlier, was not aligned, so it didn't address any objective. But the other 4 chunks of Lesson B were all working towards a single objective each. Chunks 3 and 4 were both supporting Objective 3, and that's absolutely fine. Each separate chunk 3 and 4, were only supporting one objective. They just happened to support the same one. Sometimes content and strategies for a single objective need to be broken down into multiple chunks, and that's okay. What we don't want is for a single chunk to address more than one objective. So you can have multiple chunks building up to the same objective, but you can't have multiple objectives being addressed in the same chunk. So just keep that in mind as you're building your lessons. And then the last thing that I wanted to talk about with Lesson B is more of a general commentary on summative assessment and one-shots, and I've had some one-on-one conversations with you all or with some of you about summative assessments, and a lot of you have noticed that most of the example lessons do not have summative assessments. A lot of the example lessons can't have summative assessments. Much of what we do in the one-shot as librarians cannot truly be measured by a good summative assessment. It's incredibly difficult. Sometimes the summative assessment doesn't really come until much later and we don't have any control over it, like the research paper or annotated bibliography or whatever it is that the students are doing in class as their assignment. We're not focusing on assessment in this intro course because there are a lot of other things that are just as important in a lesson plan, and we could spend a whole 6 weeks on just assessment. But what I will say about summative assessment is that you should not beat yourself up if you just can't find a way to get there. You really shouldn't try to force the summative assessment. The one-shot model is not built for that kind of assessment. It's possible, but it's not always feasible or meaningful. In the types of lessons that we're doing, I think it's more important to get in smaller, more regular formative assessments than to try to squeeze in a summative assessment that's not really meaningful. So I'm happy to continue this conversation about summative assessment elsewhere, offline, but we're really not focusing too much on it here because it is difficult, and sometimes it's just truly not possible in the one-shot model. It can be, but it's okay if you don't always have a summative assessment because it's just not going to work in this kind of model. And then lesson C, I only have a few comments on that lesson. That one was on news and data. In general, you all did a pretty good critique of that one. Some of the good comments on that one were really looking at how it was aligned to the actual assignment that was listed at the top of the lesson plan. The assignment and the lesson were just not a good fit. Someone said that it seemed like the librarian was chasing a rabbit, and I would agree. So even though a lot of the lesson was fine, there definitely some things needed to be fixed there, but it just didn't match what the students needed. And that's an important part of alignment too. It's not something specifically that we've talked about, but if you're teaching something that doesn't actually support what the students need in the class, then why are you doing it? So really good comments on that one. I was pleased with your responses there, and I think overall you did a great job critiquing these lessons. I've noticed really good comments in the group discussions from Module 4 critiquing the example lessons, and I've seen some good feedback so far on the discussion board for last week as well. So if you have not gotten feedback from me on your lesson plan yet, you should expect to have that hopefully by the end of the day today or tomorrow. There's 38 of you guys and 1 of me, and that's a lot of lesson plans to look at, so I'm trying my best to get those all back to you today if possible, so you can continue revising and getting ready to teach your class. If you have questions, you guys know where to find me, and good luck this week on Module 6, and I'll check back in soon. Have a good week, everyone.